All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're decoding Slavoj Žižek's incredibly dense, but honestly, absolutely fascinating philosophical critique of our chaotic, modern reality. If you've been feeling like the world has literally flipped upside down lately, well, you're definitely in the right place. We're going to break down exactly why that is.
So the text we're unpacking today is called Surplus Enjoyment. Now, it's famous for its paradoxical logic, but don't worry, we're going to strictly and impartially break down its core arguments so you can really grasp the mechanics of this philosophy.
To give us the kind of cognitive mapping the author says society is completely lacking right now, here is our roadmap. We'll start with a topsy-turvy world, move on to catastrophe versus apocalypse, examine the rise of neo-feudalism, dig into the paradox of surplus enjoyment, and wrap up with finding a way forward. Let's get right into Section 1, a topsy-turvy world and what happens when reality reverses. The text anchors its whole premise on Hegel's concept of die verkehrte Welt, which translates to the topsy-turvy world. It argues that we're living in this maddening reality where our best-laid plans and highest ideals inevitably just mutate into their exact opposite. Think about it. We live in an era where dreams of total freedom sometimes become spaces of terror, or where systems generating unprecedented, massive wealth are simultaneously generating mass poverty. It's like reality itself has reversed its polarity. And this perfectly illustrates how multiple, overlapping crises are basically competing for our attention right now. You've got the COVID-19 pandemic, global warming, erupting class antagonisms, and the looming threat of full digital control. The source material argues these aren't just isolated events. They're actively fighting for primacy. They're competing to be the ultimate focal point of our global anxiety.
Which brings us to Section 2, Catastrophe versus Apocalypse, and analyzing the chaos.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the author forces us to distinguish between two words we totally casually use interchangeably. A catastrophe? That's just naked destruction. It's a downfall without any new kingdom rising from the ashes. But an apocalypse, in its original ancient Greek sense, is an uncovering. It's the disclosure of a hidden, profound truth that shatters the world. The crucial takeaway is the assertion that our daily normality is actually post-apocalyptic. We are constantly bouncing from a catastrophe to uncovering a new truth, and then right back to catastrophe again.
Let's transition from philosophy over to economics for Section 3, the rise of neo-feudalism and the economic shift.
So the text lays out this massive economic argument that we are mutating away from traditional capitalism. Under traditional capitalism, the focus was on exploiting direct labor time and extracting profit from workers. But now, we're entering what's called corporate neo-feudalism. Tech monopolies are privatizing the general intellect, meaning our collective social knowledge and cooperation. So instead of extracting profit, they extract rent. And instead of being traditional workers, we basically become serfs, paying rent just to exist in these digital spaces.
To really hammer this home, the author points to figures like Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Gates. There's this quote noting that Zuckerberg has unilateral control over 3 billion people. 3 billion! The argument is that the modern public square is rapidly vanishing into private hands. We are constantly paying a toll, whether with our data or our attention, to the new feudal lords of the internet.
To ground this theory in physical reality, the text highlights the 996 work culture in China. To put that into perspective, that is working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. The author uses the government's pushback against this extreme demand to illustrate the tension happening globally between state power and these massive corporate entities that basically demand total surrender.
Okay, so let's move to Section 4, the paradox of surplus enjoyment. This is the psychological hook and arguably the most fascinating part of the whole text.
Think about it. If the system is so exploitative, if we're all just digital serfs in a topsy-turvy world of constant crisis, we have to ask the central psychological question of this entire explainer. Why do we enjoy our oppression? It's a deeply Freudian question, and it's the massive narrative puzzle that explains why we just endure our circumstances instead of revolting.
The answer lies in this concept: surplus enjoyment, or Lustgewinn. The author defines this as an excess. It's a perverted pleasure found in renunciation itself, a paradoxical gain and loss. Basically, the system doesn't just hold us down with fear. We are essentially bribed for our obedience with this perverse hidden pleasure in the very act of giving things up, or following the rules.
The text uses this really striking anecdote to explain it. There's a story of a woman who is told by her lover that if she lost just 2 kilos, she'd be absolutely perfect.
But the author argues that, actually, scratch that, if she literally lost the weight, she'd lose her charm and just look ordinary. The point here is that a detail, disturbing perfection, is what actually creates the illusion of perfection. Lacking something is what generates the desire.
Here's another pretty stark example from the source material. It references an actor on a porn set who loses his physical arousal mid-scene. And to get it back, he turns away from the real person right in front of him, grabs his phone, and looks up a fantasy online. It perfectly illustrates the author's point that human reality is inherently glued to fantasy. We literally require the artificial support of fantasy to function, even in our most basic physical realities.
The author even leverages that funny, apocryphal legend about Neil Armstrong to make this point. You know the one. Young Armstrong supposedly overhears his neighbor's wife yelling, "You'll get sex when the kid next door walks on the moon." Decades later, he actually does it. What this brilliantly shows, according to the author, is how delayed gratification and impossible obstacles are exactly what generate this strange surplus enjoyment that keeps us moving.
All right, let's head into our final section, Section 5, Finding a Way Forward, and looking at the philosophical responses to all this.
How does the text propose we get out of this paralyzing loop? Well, it invokes a metaphor from Lenin about a climber on a high mountain. You attempt the ascent to a new peak. You fail, so you have to descend back to the valley. But you don't just stay there, you preserve your strength to begin from the beginning, over and over again. The author argues that true radical change means abandoning the idea of smooth, linear progress. Sometimes you literally have to retreat all the way back to zero. And while we're figuring this out, to stop society from fracturing into tribal factions, the author advocates for Immanuel Kant's model of public reason. It's a simple but demanding three-step process. Think freely. State your thoughts publicly and debate them, but ultimately obey the communal rules. The text uses public health mandates as an example. We must be free to vigorously debate things like vaccines in public, but we still have to cooperate with the regulations to keep society functioning. But to break that deep psychological cycle of surplus enjoyment, that requires something much more extreme. The text calls it subjective destitution. This is a radical, honestly kind of jarring philosophical move, where we acquire distance from our so-called inner wealth, meaning all our comforting narratives, our victimhood, our pride, our ideologies. We strip all that baggage away to become a pure, empty subject, ready for true, unclouded change.
Because at the end of the day, the stakes couldn't be higher. The text leaves us with a powerful reminder that history is not just automatically on our side. It states, the moment we fully accept the fact that we live on a spaceship Earth, the task that urgently imposes itself is that of forging universal solidarity. The warning here is clear. Without profound global solidarity, the trajectory of our neo-feudal, topsy-turvy system is headed straight toward collective catastrophe.
So we have to ask ourselves this final, provocative question drawn directly from the text's core challenge. Are we actually prepared to step off the mountain, embrace subjective destitution, and start from the beginning over and over again? Can we truly abandon our comfortable fictions to confront the reality of our topsy-turvy world? It's a massive question for sure, and one that should definitely keep you thinking long after this explainer is over.